Hello, welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and today I'm offering another episode or another conversation in my series on Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Now, if you've been following these conversations, you know that we are on chapter 4, which is the final chapter. And in chapter 4, Freire first explains what he calls the theory of anti dialogical action. These are the actions perpetrated by policies instituted by the oppressor class. And he discusses it under four registers: the conquest, which I covered in the previous conversation, divide and rule, manipulation, and cultural invasion. So today I'll be reading a part of the divide and rule discussion. How does divide and rule work for the oppressing class against the oppressed, right? That's kind of a loose binary, which is not necessarily a strict binary that we are working with in Freire, right? And so, as always, I'll read first and then share my insights about the passages that we read. Now, I'm just reading a brief part of Freire's section on divide and rule. And then there is a note in my first reading. It is note 17 in the chapter, which I'll also attach to the reading. And then I'll talk about the reading and share my ideas. But also, that note is really important. So here we go. This is another fundamental dimension of the theory of oppressive action, which is as old as oppression itself. As the oppressor minority subordinates and dominates the majority, it must divide it and keep it divided in order to remain in power. The minority cannot permit itself the luxury of tolerating the unification of the people, which would undoubtedly signify a serious threat to their own hegemony. Accordingly, the oppressors halt by any method, including violence, any action which in even incipient fashion could awaken the oppressed to the need for unity. Concepts such as unity, organization, and struggle are immediately labeled as dangerous. In fact, of course, these concepts are dangerous to the oppressors, for their realization is necessary to actions of liberation. It is in the interest of the oppressor to weaken the oppressed still further, to isolate them, to create and deepen rifts among them. This is done by varied means, from the repressive methods of the government bureaucracy to the forms of cultural action with which they manipulate the people by giving them the impression that they are being helped. One of the characteristics of oppressive cultural action, which is almost never perceived by the dedicated but naive professionals who are involved in the emphasis on a focalized view of the problems rather than on seeing them as dimensions of a totality. In community development projects, the more a region or area is broken down into local communities without the study of these communities, both as totalities in themselves and as parts of another totality, the area, region, and so forth, which in turn is part of a still larger totality, the nation, as part of the continental totality, the more alienation is intensified. And the more alienated people are, the easier it is to divide them and keep them divided. These focalized forms of action, by intensifying the focalized way of life of the oppressed, especially in rural areas, hamper the oppressed from perceiving reality critically and keep them isolated from the problems of oppressed women and men in other areas. Note 17. This criticism, of course, does not apply to actions within a dialectical perspective, based on the understanding of the local community both as a totality in itself and as part of a larger totality. It is directed at those who do not realize that the development of the local community cannot occur except in the total context of which it is a part, in interaction with other parts. This requirement implies the consciousness of unity in diversification, of organization which channels forces in dispersion, and a clear awareness of the necessity to transform reality. This, understandably, is what frightens the oppressors. So, there are two things that become really clear in what I just read, including the note. Now, Freire is talking about community building, but he's talking about the dangers of focalization. Now, think of it. It might help us revise how we think of regionalism, right? Or what we have made into, especially in post-colonial theory, a total denial of totality and focus on what we consider the periphery or peripheral identities. And there is a danger in that he's pointing out. And the danger is that in thinking the community, if we just jettison everything that is outside of the community and treat the community as a self sustaining unit, study it even, or talk about its rights, then we will form regional identities, focalized identities. I am Baluch, I am Pathan, I am Yoruba, right? And revel in them. And maybe try to purify them, right? Whose interest does it serve, right? Obviously, it serves the interest of the dominant group, because if we are divided amongst our own little communities here and there, and if we keep privileging that and even fetishizing that, then the possibility of lateral alliances is foreclosed. So that is what he's cautioning against, right? And the note forestalls, any objections by suggesting that if it is dialogical, then it's okay, because I am studying and working with my own community, but I know that that community doesn't exist in isolation, that it exists in a larger system and in a larger system. So when we think of community and when we think of building it, we have to work within the community, know its logic, know its system of working, but then look at what is the system within which that community exists, because that system is shaping it in so many ways. And then the larger systems, put it within the larger context. Now that then enables us to understand how power is working to shape the way a community thinks itself, right? Two, it then also enables us to see what other communities are facing the same kind of oppression, so we can build solidarities instead of saying, you know, you're brown, I'm African American, I'm Mexican American, we have our own peculiar problems, we and we compete each other. Because if we really exclusively start thinking about our own focalized communities, then it is easy to mobilize us against each other. Right? That is divide and rule. Uh, think of the examples. Who did the British use in India? Right? They heightened the regional and ethnic identities, and then they mobilized one ethnic identity against the other. Right? And so the national leaders, the project for them was to acknowledge that these ethnic and regional communities existed separately, but they had a common interest. So for revolutionary dialogical action, that is necessary. So that is what he's talking about in terms of communities and how to approach them, and that one way the oppressing group, wherever they are, they encourage this focalized view of the community and its aspirations and its hopes, and that then isolates the community from the larger context within which it exists. And that larger context is necessary because it points to the system of oppression, but also it allows members of one community to build solidarities with others. So that was, what I just read, including the note. Let's read a little more where he talks about leadership training and what are the flaws in it and how do the oppressors or the oppressing groups use that to manipulate people and communities. The same divisive effect occurs in connection with the so-called leadership training courses, which are, although carried out without any such intention by many of their organizers, in the last analysis alienating. These courses are based on the naive assumption that one can promote the community by training its leaders, as if it were the parts that promote the whole and not the whole which, in being promoted, promotes the parts. Those members of the communities who show sufficient leadership capacities to be chosen for these courses necessarily reflect and express the aspiration of the individuals of their community. They are in harmony with the way of living and thinking about reality which characterizes their comrades, even though they reveal special abilities which give them the status of leaders. As soon as they complete the course and return to the community with resources that they did not formerly possess, they either use these resources to control the submerged and dominated consciousness of their comrades, or they become strangers in their own communities and their former leadership position is thus threatened. In order not to lose their leadership status, they will probably tend to continue manipulating the community but in a more efficient manner. When cultural action as a totalized and totalizing process approaches an entire community and not merely its leaders, the opposite process occurs. Either the former leaders grow along with everyone else or they are replaced by new leaders who emerge as a result of the new social consciousness of the community. The oppressors do not favor promoting the community as a whole, but rather selected leaders. The latter course, by preserving a state of alienation, hinders the emergence of consciousness and critical intervention in a total reality. And without this critical intervention, it is always difficult to achieve the unity of the oppressed as a class. So these brief paragraphs are about another cautionary thing to keep in mind, and that is about leadership training. Now, this training could be the dominant group or also could be from within the community, but the idea that you can train top down, pick up people who claim leadership of a community or are considered leaders of a community and then train them in revolutionary mode or any other mode and then send them back to train the community. That's the model that even a lot of NGOs follow. And what Freire sees is the problem is, first of all, if the oppressors are training these people, then they are training them in looking at their own culture from the point of view of the oppressing class. So these people, when they go into their community, they themselves are alienated from their own communities. But then they would develop a certain kind of disdain for their own communities. That comes across in colonial education very clearly. I have quite a few videos on it. Ngugi Thiong'o writes about it, is that Western educated elite in so many national cultures under colonialism, when they go back to their own cultures, since they have bought into whatever has been taught to them, they become suspicious of their own communities, and then their own communities don't trust them anymore because they are not seen as authentic members of that community. So the idea is not to pick up leaders and train them and then hope that they will train the community. The idea is to build a whole community, right? And then within that, whosoever emerges as a leader would be someone who espouses the aspirations, the hopes, and knowledge of the community itself, right? So we cannot approach the question of community building from just a leadership training point of view. First of all, we already know from chapter 3 that the curriculum for training that will be developed by the researchers will be developed with the voice of the community in it, right? We already know that we can't bring it from home and say, here, we'll teach you how to be. It's a step by step process, right? But two, we cannot just train people at the top and hope that they will go and train the others. The top must rise from the very system that is being developed, which is in sync with the aspirations of the community. So the anti-dialogic forces would use the method of just training the elite and sending them down because that's a method of control, right? Um, these elite then become cultural informants to the powerful, but at the same time, they keep their own people appeased and they are not sincere to their own people and they end up manipulating their own people. So that keeps perpetuating the system that the revolutionary process is supposed to change. And the only way of changing it is to let leaders emerge from the system of liberation and liberatory pedagogy that would transform a community. So, these are some of my thoughts on this section of the chapter. Remember, in this chapter, Freire is bringing all that he has taught us in developing a praxis. And as his other work, he first spends some time in explaining to us what are the four main dimensions of what he calls theory of anti-dialogical actions. We have already discussed conquest, and here today I have started our discussion of divide and rule. Then we'll go through manipulation and cultural invasion. And then towards the end of the chapter and the end of the book, he will give us four practices and concepts that counter these four as a form of dialogical action against anti-dialogical action. So that's where we are headed. We are pretty close to finishing the discussion of the book. And I hope it has been useful to you. And as if you have any questions, please post them. If you like this series, let me know in the comments. Also, please do subscribe to the channel. I also have a short Udemy course on pedagogy of the oppressed, which I will constantly keep building. I do encourage you to see if you would like to, take that course. The link is in the description. That's all. And one more request, if you have the resources or time, please do become a member of the channel. Or if you feel like it, there is a support link under this video. If you're on a computer, you can always support individual videos as well. That's it. I hope you're staying safe. Take care of each other, be generous and kind, and I will now see you next time. Until then, as always, peace and love.